On the morning Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ralston, knelt before her, Cecilia Vane had already said goodbye to three things. She had said goodbye to her garden, the small, unimpressive patch of roses behind her father's old house that no one had tended since his death, and that she had somehow kept alive through 2 winters with nothing but stubbornness and cold hands. She had said goodbye to her books, all 41 of them, wrapped carefully in brown paper and left in a stack by the door of the village lending library, because she had decided that books deserved to be read, not inherited by distant cousins who wouldn't know what they were holding. And she had said goodbye to Pip, the small brown dog who slept at her feet every night and who had, that very morning, placed his chin on her knee and looked at her with the kind of understanding that only animals and very old people seem capable of. She had not said goodbye to Edmund Ashford, because she never thought she would have to. The library at Ashford Park smelled like wood smoke and old paper, and Cecilia had been standing in it for approximately 4 minutes before she realized she was not alone. She had not been invited to wander. Lady Miriam Holt, her oldest friend, her only confidant, and the one person on earth who knew what the doctor had said 3 weeks ago, had insisted she come for the fortnight. You cannot spend your remaining time staring at walls, Cease. Come. The estate is beautiful in autumn. Edmund won't even notice you're there. He never notices anyone. That had seemed at the time like a reasonable assurance. Cecilia ran one finger along the spine of a leather-bound volume. She had no intention of pulling from the shelf. It was simply something to do with her hands. She had been doing that lately, finding small tasks for her hands so that the rest of her might stay still. She did not hear him come in. She only knew he was there when he spoke. "That one is dreadful," said a low voice from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "I've read it twice." Both times were a mistake. Cecilia did not startle. She had grown in recent months, very calm about unexpected things. She turned slowly and found Edmund Ashford standing 3 feet away, holding a glass of brandy he did not appear to be drinking, watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. She had seen him once before, 2 years ago briefly, at a county assembly she had attended with Miriam. He had been pointed out to her across the room. Duke of Ralston. Just returned from the peninsula. Doesn't dance. He had looked from a distance, like a man made entirely of angles, sharp jaw, straight shoulders, the kind of stillness that rooms tend to arrange themselves around. Up close, he looked like a man who had not slept properly in a very long time. "I'll take your word for it," Cecilia said, and turned back to the shelf. There was a pause. She heard him move not toward her, but to one of the leather chairs by the window, where he sat with the particular careful weight of someone managing an old injury. She pretended not to notice. He pretended not to notice her pretending. They remained like that for some minutes, she at the shelves, he at the window, in a silence that was, surprisingly, not uncomfortable. "You're Miriam's friend," he said eventually. "Cecilia Vane," she confirmed. "Baron Vane's daughter." Another pause. "He died last spring." "He did. I'm sorry." She considered telling him that she was not, particularly, that her father had been a weak and foolish man who had drunk himself through 2 inheritances and left her with a crumbling house and a stack of unpaid accounts. She decided against it. "Thank you," she said instead. Edmund Ashford said nothing more. He finished his brandy. He left. Cecilia stood in the library for a long moment after the door closed, her finger still resting on the spine of the dreadful book, and thought, well, that was nothing. She revised that opinion over the following 10 days. He did not seek her out, not exactly. But he appeared. In the breakfast room when she came down early, because sleeping had become difficult. In the East Garden when she walked there in the afternoons, because the air helped. Once, memorably, in the corridor outside the music room, where he stood listening to her play for a full 7 minutes before she noticed him and stopped, and he said only, "Don't stop on my account," in a tone that suggested he meant it. Miriam watched all of this with an expression Cecilia did not trust. "He's simply being polite," Cecilia told her, on the 9th morning over cold toast and tea. "Edmund," said Miriam carefully, "has not been polite to a house guest in 4 years. Then he's practicing." "Cease, Miriam." Cecilia looked at her steadily. "Don't." Miriam pressed her lips together and said nothing. But she looked at her plate with the expression of someone who has already decided on a course of action and is simply waiting for the correct moment. The correct moment, as it turned out, was the following afternoon. Cecilia was in the library again. She had developed a habit of it, which she recognized as unwise and continued anyway. When the door opened, and Edmund came in with the settled purposefulness of a man who had been somewhere else, decided against it, and come here instead. He stopped when he saw her. She waited. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. And then, without preamble, without any of the careful social scaffolding that these moments were supposed to involve, no drawing room, no chaperone, no prepared speech, Edmund Ashford went down on one knee on the library floor and looked up at her with an expression she still could not name, but that struck her, suddenly, as the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face. "Miss Vane," he said, "I recognize that this is abrupt. I recognize that we have known each other for 10 days, and that I have not handled those 10 days with any particular grace. I am not a man who does this sort of thing easily, and I suspect that is obvious." A pause. "I'm also not a man who is good at waiting when he knows his own mind." Cecilia's hand had gone very still against the shelf. "I am asking you to marry me," Edmund said. "Not because it would be convenient. Not because the estate requires an heir, or the season requires a duchess. Because you are the only person in this house, possibly in some years, who has sat in a room with me and not tried to fill the silence. Because you play Schubert in an empty room when you think no one is listening. Because you said thank you when you meant something else entirely, and I understood exactly what you meant." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I am aware this is not a conventional speech." "No," Cecilia agreed. Her voice was very even. She was quite proud of that. "I am not a conventional man." The room was quiet. Through the tall windows, the autumn light was the particular low gold of late afternoon, and it lay across the floor between them like something physical, like something that could be stepped over or stood in. Cecilia looked at Edmund Ashford, kneeling on her behalf on a library floor, brandy-eyed and unslept and utterly serious, and felt something move through her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not quite hope, because hope had become a complicated thing but was related to it. A cousin of it. She thought about that morning's letter, folded in her pocket. Dr. Hargrove's careful handwriting. "At most 6 months, Miss Vane, and that is if you are careful." She thought about Pip and the roses and the 41 books. She thought about the word yes, how it would feel in her mouth. How it would feel in his ear. "I need time," she said. Edmund blinked. It was the first moment in 10 days she had seen him surprised. "Time," he repeated. "A few days," she kept her voice level. "This is not a small question, Your Grace." He rose slowly, and she saw the careful way he straightened the old injury in his left leg, she thought, though he would never say so. He looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable expression, and then he nodded once. "A few days," he said. Of course he left. Cecilia stood in the library until she heard his footsteps disappear down the corridor. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, the leather one by the window where he had sat that first afternoon, and pressed both hands flat against her knees. She did not cry. She had made a decision some months ago about crying. It spent too much of what she had left. Instead, she looked out at the autumn garden, gold and brown and impossibly beautiful, and thought, very clearly for the first time in weeks, "This is the cruelest thing that has ever happened to me." And she meant it as a gift. The first thing Miriam said the next morning was, "Did you say yes?" She appeared in Cecilia's doorway before the maid had finished with the curtains, still in her dressing gown, hair unpinned, with the expression of a woman who had not slept because she had been too busy hoping on someone else's behalf. Cecilia was sitting at the small writing desk by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. She had been sitting there since 5 o'clock. Outside, the garden was white with morning frost, every blade of grass standing stiff and separate, beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they are about to disappear. "Close the door," Cecilia said. Miriam closed it. She came to sit on the edge of the bed, tucking her feet beneath her the way she had done since they were girls, sharing a narrow settee in her mother's parlor. She waited. "How could I?" Cecilia said. The words sat between them, quiet and final, like stones placed rather than thrown. Miriam pressed her mouth together. She had known, of course she had known. She always knew, but knowing and hearing were different things. And for a moment her face did something complicated that she quickly schooled back into composure. "Cease," she began. "Don't tell me it wouldn't matter," Cecilia said. Not sharply. She was past sharp. "Don't tell me he would understand, or that I deserve happiness, or any of the other things you've been rehearsing since yesterday afternoon. I know you've been rehearsing them. You have a rehearsing face. I don't have a rehearsing face. You do. Your left eyebrow does something." Miriam's hand went involuntarily to her left eyebrow. Cecilia almost smiled. "Almost. I cannot say yes to a man I am going to leave," she said. "That is the beginning and end of it. He would spend the rest of his life." She stopped. "Started again. He has already lost enough." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird landed on the frost-covered windowsill, looked in at them both with what seemed like judgment, and left. "When did you know?" Miriam asked softly. "Not about Edmund. About the other thing." Cecilia turned the cold cup in her hands. "2 winters ago, I thought it was simply the season. Last spring I knew." She paused. "I told no one because there was no one to tell. Father was already gone. You had just had the baby." There was no another pause. "There was no version of telling people that didn't end with me, watching them grieve before I did. I decided I'd rather do it privately." "That is the most Cecilia Vane thing I have ever heard," Miriam said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "Please don't." "I'm not." Miriam straightened. She pressed her fingertips to her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Cecilia counted, and then lowered her hands and looked at her with something fierce and clear. "All right. But I want to say one thing, and then I'll leave it alone." Cecilia waited. "You have been managing everyone else's grief since before your father was in the ground. You have been small and quiet and undemanding your entire life because someone always needed you to be." Miriam's voice was steady now, the way it got when she believed something completely. "I am asking you, I am not telling you, I am asking, to consider that saying yes might not be something you do for him. It might be something you do for yourself." She stood, smoothed her dressing gown with both hands and moved toward the door. "That's all. I'll leave it alone now." She left. Cecilia looked at the cold garden for a long time. She did not, for the moment, change her mind. But she held Miriam's words carefully. The way you carried something fragile, not close enough to crush it, not far enough to drop it. The trouble with Edmund Ashford, she discovered over the following 3 days, was that he did not pressure her. She had expected pressure. Pressure was something she knew how to resist. Pressure was a door you simply didn't open. What he did instead was nothing, or what looked like nothing but wasn't. He left a book outside her door on the second morning. No note. Just a slim volume of botanical illustrations, English garden flowers, hand-tinted, clearly old and clearly valued. She opened it to find that someone, him, she had no doubt, had pressed a single dried sprig of something between the pages. She didn't know what it was. She spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to identify it. He sat across from her at dinner and did not watch her. But when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did in houses like this one, to people's ailments, Lady Forthright's gout, old Colonel Hamish's chest, and Cecilia went very still in the particular way she had trained herself to go still, she noticed that Edmund, without looking at her, turned the conversation. Smoothly, completely, with the practiced ease of a man who had done difficult things in difficult situations, and knew how to move without being seen to move. She noticed. She thought he knew she noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. On the third morning, she came down to find a letter waiting at her place at the breakfast table. Not from Edmund, from Dr. Hargrove, forwarded from her address. She recognized the handwriting before she touched it, and felt the familiar cold settle into her sternum. She folded it and placed it in her pocket and ate her breakfast, and did not read it until she was alone. It said what she had expected it to say. The symptoms you described suggest progression. I would strongly advise against overexertion, extended travel, or significant emotional strain. Significant emotional strain. She looked out the window at the frost-pale garden and laughed one short, quiet sound because she couldn't help it. She did not hear the Dowager Duchess come up behind her. Eleanor Ashford, Edmund's mother, 61 years old, impeccably dressed at all hours, with the kind of posture that suggested a lifelong argument with softness, appeared in the morning room doorway as Cecilia was folding Hargrove's letter back into her pocket. She looked at Cecilia with eyes that were Edmund's eyes, older and more practiced, and said, "I'd like a word." It was not a request. The Dowager's private sitting room was everything the rest of Ashford Park was not: small, warm, aggressively personal. Portraits on every wall. A writing desk buried under correspondence. A small dog, older and fatter than Pip, with the defeated expression of an animal that had long since accepted its circumstances, asleep on a velvet footstool. The Dowager sat. She did not invite Cecilia to sit. Cecilia sat anyway, because she had decided, some months ago, to stop waiting for permission for things. The Dowager looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone assembling the correct words in the correct order. Then she said, "You are not suitable for my son." Cecilia held her gaze. You may be right. That, apparently, was not the answer the Dowager had prepared for. Something shifted slightly in her expression. She recalibrated. "He is a duke," she continued. "He requires, the position requires, a wife who is capable of the full demands of the role. Socially, physically, and in terms of continuity." She paused delicately on that last word. "An heir," Cecilia said. "Among other things, you believe I am not capable of those things." The Dowager's chin lifted. "I believe the question is worth examining before my son commits himself to a course from which there is no graceful retreat." The room was very quiet. The old dog shifted on its footstool and wheezed. Cecilia looked at the Dowager Duchess, at the rigid set of her shoulders, the controlled precision of her hands in her lap, the faint tension at the corners of her eyes, and felt, with a sudden and unexpected clarity, that she was looking at something she recognized. Not cruelty. Fear. This woman was afraid. Profoundly, specifically afraid, and not of Cecilia, not exactly. Of something Cecilia represented. Some outcome she had already imagined in full detail in the quiet of this small, warm room, with its portraits and its letters and its sleeping dog. She knows, Cecilia thought. The certainty arrived without drama, without evidence she could name, just the particular recognition of one person carrying a secret, seeing another person carry it too. She knows, and she is trying to protect him, and she has no idea that we want exactly the same thing. As she stood, the Dowager blinked. She had not been finished clearly. You are right that I am not suitable, Cecilia said, keeping her voice very even. I intend to tell him so. You have my word. She left before the Dowager could answer. She walked down the corridor and up the stairs and into her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and she thought about what the Dowager's face had looked like in that last moment, the split second before composure closed back over it. She was relieved, Cecilia thought. And she was devastated. Both at once. She understood that completely. That evening, Miriam knocked. She came in and sat in the chair by the fire, and looked at Cecilia with an expression that said she had been thinking hard since morning and had arrived somewhere. The Dowager spoke to you, she said. She did. What did she say? That I'm not suitable. Miriam's eyes darkened. She had no right. She wasn't wrong, Cecilia said quietly. Miriam. She looked at her oldest friend, at the familiar face, the worried eyes, the left eyebrow already doing its thing. She wasn't wrong. And I'm going to tell him no. Silence. Cease, I've decided. Miriam looked at her for a long, long moment. All right, she said finally. Her voice was careful. Controlled. But I want you to know something first. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at Cecilia with the directness that had always been her most alarming quality. I want you to know that if you say no because you are trying to protect him, I will respect it. But if you say no because you believe you are not worth the trouble, she stopped. Her jaw was tight. Then I will argue with you. Every day. For as long as we have. Cecilia said nothing. You deserve one good thing, Miriam said. Before you deserve one good thing, the fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 8. Cecilia looked at her hands, at the thin fingers, the faint shadows that hadn't been there 2 years ago. She thought about the book left outside her door. The dried sprig she still hadn't identified. The way Edmund had turned a dinner conversation without anyone seeing him do it. She didn't change her mind that night. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she wasn't completely sure of it. The yes came on a Tuesday. It came quietly, without ceremony, in the East Garden at 2:30 in the afternoon, while a thin November rain was just beginning to decide whether it meant it or not. Cecilia had gone out without an umbrella because she had stopped carrying one, a small, private rebellion against the business of preparing for weather, and Edmund had followed her out, or perhaps had already been there. It was difficult to say which. She had been standing at the far end of the garden path, looking at the bare rose beds, when she heard his footsteps on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn around. I've been thinking, she said to the rose beds. So have I, said Edmund, from somewhere just behind her left shoulder. He had a talent for that position, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. She had noticed it was deliberate. I've been thinking about what it means to be selfish, she said again. And I've decided that I've been confusing selfishness with self-preservation for so long that I'm not certain I know the difference anymore. She stopped. The rain made up its mind and began, gently to fall. Your mother came to see me. I know, his voice was even. I spoke to her about it. You didn't need to do that. I did, a brief pause. What she said to you was not, it was not her place. And it was not accurate. Cecilia turned around then, because she wanted to see his face when she said the next part. Edmund was standing on the path in the thin rain with no more preparedness for weather than she had, no hat, no greatcoat, and looking at her with that expression, she still did not have a name for but had spent the past 11 days studying. She wasn't entirely wrong, Cecilia said. Edmund said nothing. He waited. She had learned that about him, that he waited with his whole attention, not with half of it while preparing his response. I want to say yes, she said. Each word was careful and distinct, placed like something she was certain of. I want to say yes, and I want you to know that I mean it, not out of gratitude, not out of circumstance, not because I have nowhere else to go. I mean it because she stopped. Because you are the most surprising person I have met in a very long time, and I was not expecting to meet anyone surprising again. The rain fell softly between them. That is not a yes yet, Edmund said. No, Cecilia agreed. It isn't. She thought about Miriam's face the night before, the firelight, the tight jaw. You deserve one good thing. She thought about the letter in her pocket, Hargrove's careful handwriting. She thought about the plan she had assembled in the dark of 4 o'clock that morning, lying still in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling and building it piece by piece like a house. She intended to live in briefly and vacate without damage. They would marry. She would have her months, good months, whatever months there were, and Edmund would have a wife who was present and willing and genuinely, devastatingly glad to be there. And when the end came, it would come as illness comes in these stories, as it was supposed to come, gradually, then suddenly, and then it would simply be a grief he could survive. Duke survived grief. The world was full of widowed dukes. He would be all right. He would be all right because she would make sure of it. She would not let him watch her diminish. She would manage it. She was good at managing things. It was, she recognized even as she constructed it, a very foolish plan. It was also the only one she had. Yes, she said. Edmund went very still. Yes, she said again, because it needed saying twice, once for him, once for herself. I'll marry you. He looked at her for a long moment, the rain falling on both of them, and then he did something she had not anticipated. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her hand or make any of the ceremonial gestures the moment was supposed to call for. He simply closed his eyes briefly, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, with the expression of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for a long time. When he opened them, he looked younger. Not young. She did not think Edmund Ashford had ever been entirely young, but younger than he had this morning, younger than he had at dinner last night, younger than he had been in all the 11 days of her careful, cataloging observation. Thank you, he said quietly. It was such an unexpected thing to say that Cecilia felt something loosen in her throat, that she had been keeping very tightly held. Don't thank me, she said, and was surprised to find that her voice was perfectly steady. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked back toward the house in the thin November rain, not speaking, and it was the most companionable silence Cecilia had experienced in longer than she could accurately calculate. At the door, Edmund stopped. He looked down at her with that unreadable expression and said, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to stay. He said it simply, like a fact he was reporting. Cecilia's chest did something she did not have a word for. "I'll do my best," she said. She meant it as a comfort. It came out like a confession. That night Miriam came. She appeared in the doorway before Cecilia had even lit the second candle, with the expression of someone who had been listening for footsteps in the corridor and had given up pretending otherwise. "Well," she said. I said yes. Miriam's face did three things in rapid succession: relief, joy, and then something more complicated, something that lived in the space between happiness and grief, which Cecilia knew well because she lived there herself. "Oh, cease," she said. "Don't, I'm not." Miriam came in and sat on the bed and looked at her with clear eyes. I'm glad. I'm very glad." Cecilia sat at the writing desk, her hands flat on the surface, looking at the dark window. The rain had stopped. Outside, the garden was very still. "I have a plan," she said. Miriam went slightly careful. "What kind of plan?" "A sensible one." Cecilia turned to face her. "We marry. I have whatever time I have, and I will be present for it. I will be entirely present, I promise you that. And when things begin to, when it becomes clear that," she stopped. "Start it again. I will manage how it appears. He will not watch me become less. He'll grieve a wife who was, until near the end, herself. That's survivable. That's the kind of grief a person comes back from." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "And you've thought about this thoroughly," she said carefully. "I've thought about little else." Another pause. "And Edmund has no part in this plan. No choice. His choice is the marriage. That's the important choice." "Cease." Miriam's voice was gentle, but underneath the gentleness was something firm, something that had been there since they were 16 years old and Cecilia had made a different foolish plan, and Miriam had let her get to the third step before saying anything. "You are planning to manage his grief for him. Before you've even caused it. Yes, you are planning to decide on his behalf how much he's allowed to know and when." A pause. "When you say it like that, I'm saying it correctly." Miriam looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you not to do it. You'll do it anyway, and we both know it. But I want you to hear yourself." She stood and smoothed her skirt. "He asked you to marry him, knowing practically nothing about you. He waited 11 days without a word of pressure. He went to his mother." Her voice softened briefly. "Whatever he is, Cecilia, he is not a man who needs to be protected from the truth of his own life." She left. Cecilia sat at the dark window for a very long time. She did not change her plan. But she sat with it differently now, at a slight distance, the way you sit with something you suspect you will eventually have to put down. The engagement was announced at dinner the following evening. Edmund stood at the head of the table and said it simply, in a sentence, without theatrical preamble, the way he did everything. "Miss Vane has done me the honor of accepting my proposal. I trust you will all make her welcome." The table reacted. Lady Miriam beamed with the uninhibited delight of someone who had been waiting for good news for 2 years and intended to enjoy it completely. The Dowager Duchess sat very straight and said nothing, and looked at her plate. The two visiting cousins exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. The housekeeper, standing near the sideboard, pressed her lips together in a smile. She was trying to keep professional and failing. And across the table, through the candlelight and the crystal and the careful geometry of the Ashford Park dinner service, Edmund looked at Cecilia, just for a moment, just a second's direct attention, with an expression that was, she realized, the one she had been unable to name for 11 days. It was simply this: he was glad. Not triumphant. Not satisfied. Not relieved in the way of a man who has secured a contract, or resolved a negotiation. Just glad. Quietly, entirely glad. Cecilia held his gaze for exactly as long as she trusted herself to, and then looked down at her plate. This is a terrible plan, she thought clearly. I am going to do it anyway. Later, much later, after the household had gone to bed, she stood at her window and looked at the dark garden and thought about the word stay. I just need you to stay. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass. I'll stay as long as I can, she thought. That's all I can give you. I'll stay as long as I can, and I'll make sure every day of it counts, and when I go, I'll go quietly and you'll be all right. You'll be all right. She stayed at the window until the candle burned down. She did not sleep until nearly dawn. The engagement changed things. Not dramatically, not in the way that engagements in novels change things, with sudden social elevation and the overnight reordering of drawing room hierarchies. It changed things the way weather changed things, gradually, pervasively, in ways you noticed only when you looked back at what the air had felt like before. People were kinder to Cecilia now. Or rather, they were kind to her differently. Before, she had been Baron Vane's daughter, which was a category that carried its own set of carefully managed courtesies, adequate warmth, calibrated distance, the precise social temperature of a room that knows someone's circumstances and has made its collective decision about them. Now she was the future Duchess of Ralston. The warmth was no longer managed. It was also, she understood perfectly well, not entirely genuine, or not genuine for the reasons it presented itself as genuine. She was not suddenly more interesting. She was suddenly more powerful. These were different things, and she had lived long enough in the margins of good society to know the difference by feel. She accepted it graciously. She had been accepting things graciously her entire life. The Ashford Winter Ball was held in the third week of November. It was not, Edmund told her in his direct and unapologetic way, something he had ever enjoyed. It's been a tradition for 40 years. My father loved it. My mother considers it a duty. I consider it 200 people in my house for reasons I've never fully accepted. And yet it continues, Cecilia said. And yet it continues, he agreed, with the expression of a man at peace with the irresolvable. She had one dress suitable for a ball, the deep green silk she had worn to every formal occasion since her father's finances had made acquiring another impossible. She had worn it to 4 county assemblies, 2 London dinners, and a theatrical evening at the Holts, that she preferred not to think about. The sleeves were slightly out of fashion. The neckline was modest to the point of severity. She had long since stopped apologizing for it. She put it on the evening of the ball and stood at her mirror and looked at herself with the practical assessment of a woman who had made peace with her reflection. Not because she was satisfied with it, but because she had decided that the allocation of energy required for dissatisfaction was no longer available to her. She looked pale. She had been looking pale for 2 years. She had become skilled at the cosmetic management of it. She went downstairs. The ballroom at Ashford Park was exactly as excessive as the rest of the house was restrained. Someone, Edmund's father presumably, or perhaps several generations of Ashfords motivated by competitive grandeur, had seen fit to install a ceiling fresco, 3 chandeliers of catastrophic ambition, and a quantity of guilt that required actual resolve to look at directly. Cecilia stood at the entrance to it and thought, well. Edmund appeared at her elbow with the precision of a man who had been watching for her. He looked at her and then at the room and then back at her and said, I know, it's remarkable. My grandfather had very strong feelings about ceilings. Clearly, he offered his arm. She took it. They entered together, And the room did what rooms do. It shifted, recalibrated, reorganized its attention. Cecilia felt it the way you felt a change in pressure. She kept her chin level and her expression easy and thought about the garden. The evening moved in the way these evenings moved, in circles, literal and social, the same conversations recurring in slightly different configurations, the same assessments made and remade from different angles. Edmund stayed near. Not attached, he moved through the room with the restrained sociability of a duke fulfilling obligations, but near. She was aware of him the way you were aware of a fixed point when navigating in low light, not always looking at it, but always knowing where it is. Miriam materialized beside her at intervals, glowing with the particular satisfaction of a person who has arranged something successfully and is watching it proceed according to plan. "You look wonderful," and then quieter, "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Cecilia said each time. She was fine. Or she was fine in the way she had learned to be fine, which was the steady management of what was not fine until it became invisible. Her chest ached with the particular dull persistence she had stopped noticing except when she was still. She was not still. She danced once, with one of Edmund's cousins, a pleasant young man who talked exclusively about horses and made no demands on her beyond basic rhythmic cooperation. She danced a second time briefly with Edmund himself, a slow movement through the formal geometry of the waltz, his hand at her back with the careful pressure of a man who was aware of exactly where his hand was. "You're cold," he said quietly as they turned. "The windows," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the middle distance. "The windows," he repeated and said nothing more. It was during the second hour that Lady Harcastle appeared. Louisa Harcastle, 32, recently widowed, possessed of the particular confidence of a woman who has been considered beautiful since childhood and has had no reason to revise the assessment, moved through the ballroom with the easy authority of someone who considered herself its natural resident. She had known Edmund for years. She made this clear in the way she spoke to him, the particular proprietary ease of her conversation, the way she touched his arm briefly when she laughed. Cecilia watched this without expression. She was not jealous, or rather, she had decided she had no right to jealousy, which amounted to the same practical result if not the same internal experience. It was not Lady Harcastle who concerned her. It was the moment, an hour into the evening, when Louisa Harcastle drifted to Cecilia's side with a glass of champagne she hadn't been offered and a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be unimpeachable, cool enough to mean something. "Miss Vane," she said. "Or I suppose it will be your grace before long." A small, gracious pause. "Edmund is well. Edmund is Edmund. I do hope his future Duchess is quite well." Another pause, delicate as a blade. "In all the ways that matter," she smiled. She moved away. Cecilia stood with her hands still, and her face still, and felt the remark arrange itself inside her chest, finding the exact space it had been designed for. Across the room, Edmund was talking to an elderly general and hadn't heard. He looked up, some instinct, some directional awareness, and found her face across the distance. He held her gaze for a moment. His expression asked a question without moving. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. "Nothing. I'm fine. Continue." He continued. It happened at 10:30. She had been standing near the tall windows at the edge of the room, the real windows this time, cracked for air, the cold night pressing in at the edges when the cough came. It came the way they always came now, without warning, a sudden tightening in the chest that gave her perhaps 2 seconds of preparation. She turned toward the window, away from the room, and pressed her gloved hand to her mouth, and let the cough have its moment. When she lowered her hand, there was blood on the white glove. Small, precise, unmistakable. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she folded her hand closed, turned back to the room, and reached for a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray with her other hand, the gesture so smooth and ordinary that the footman didn't even glance at her. 3 feet away, old Lady Forthright was watching her with an expression of quiet, terrible sympathy. Cecilia met her eyes. Lady Forthright looked away first. Cecilia raised her glass and drank. Miriam found her 20 minutes later, in the corridor outside the ballroom, standing near an arrangement of hothouse lilies and breathing with the controlled evenness of someone managing pain. "I saw," Miriam said quietly. "I know, cease, I'm all right, you're not, I'm standing. I'm dressed. I'm going back in there in 2 minutes and I'm going to finish the evening because if I leave early Edmund will know something is wrong, and I'm not ready for that conversation." She looked at Miriam steadily. "So I need you to let me have 2 minutes and then come back in with me and talk to me about something ordinary. Anything. The weather. Your aunt's terrible hat. I don't care." Miriam looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "My aunt's hat was genuinely extraordinary. 3 feathers cease. From 3 different birds that had no business being on the same hat." Cecilia breathed. "That is alarming," she said. "The largest feather was taller than she is. She's quite short. The feather was not." They stood in the corridor with the sounds of the ball muffled behind the closed doors, and Cecilia breathed, and Miriam talked about the hat, and after 2 minutes, exactly as promised, they went back in. Edmund was waiting for her just inside the door. He didn't say anything. He simply fell into step beside her as she re-entered the room, and remained there for the rest of the evening, closer than before, not close enough to alarm anyone, but present in the specific way that said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Don't explain." She didn't explain. But at one point, very quietly, without looking at her, he said, "We can leave whenever you want. I only need a reason, and I'll manufacture one immediately." "I have 4 ready," she looked at him. "You've prepared excuses in advance," she said. "I prepare for contingencies. What are the 4? Household emergency. Sudden onset of my recurring headache, which is real for the record and requires no embellishment. My cousin George said something inappropriate, which is always available as an option because George reliably provides material." And he paused. "A 4th one that requires you to look faint on cue. I didn't want to rely on that one without your consent." Cecilia looked at him, this angular, careful, quietly extraordinary man who had prepared 4 exit strategies for her comfort, and felt something move through her that she had no plan for. "I'm all right," she said. "But thank you," he nodded once. He stayed where he was. At 11 o'clock, Lady Harcastle passed them again, and this time she looked at Cecilia with the clear, assessing gaze of someone who has made a calculation and is reviewing their arithmetic. "You know," Cecilia thought, meeting her eyes. Lady Harcastle moved on. "Half this room knows," Cecilia thought, "and the other half suspects. And he is the only person standing here who doesn't." She looked at Edmund, his profile sharp in the candlelight, his attention on the room with the steady vigilance of a man who had learned to watch things carefully. "Tell him," said something in her chest. "Just tell him. Tonight." It would take 30 seconds. She folded the thought up carefully and put it away. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. The guests began to leave at midnight. Cecilia stood with Edmund in the entrance hall while carriages were called and coats were retrieved, saying the appropriate things to the appropriate people, performing the small social ballet of departure with a fluency she did not have to think about. And then the hall was empty, and the footmen were extinguishing the outer lights, and Miriam had gone up, and the dowager had retired an hour ago, and it was only Edmund and Cecilia standing in the quiet entrance hall of Ashford Park at 10 past midnight. He looked tired. Not unwell. Edmund never looked unwell, but tired in the deep way of a man who had been performing steadiness all evening and could now, in the absence of an audience, stop. "Go to bed," Cecilia said gently. In a moment, he looked at her that full, quiet attention. "Are you all right?" "Honestly." She looked back at him. "Tell him," said the thing in her chest. "Tell him right now. He's tired and his guard is down and he would listen, and it would be over and you could stop carrying it alone." She looked at his face, the tiredness in it, the care in it, the particular quality of his attention that had been, from the very first evening in the library, the most unsettling thing about him. She made a decision. She was going to tell him. She was going to do it tonight, right now, standing in this entrance hall in her too old green dress with the cold coming in under the front door. And she was going to say the words she had been carrying for 2 years, and she was going to let him decide what to do with them, and she was going to stop managing everything alone. She drew breath. She said, "Edmund, there's something I need to." The study door opened. The Dowager Duchess stood in the doorway. Her face, when she saw both of them standing there, did something complicated, surprise, and then resolution, and then the particular look of a woman who has been waiting for an opportunity and recognizes it. She looked at her son. "Edmund," she said, "come in here. Please." Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been crying recently and had stopped very recently. Edmund looked at Cecilia. Cecilia looked at the Dowager. "Go," Cecilia said quietly. He went. The door did not quite close. Cecilia stood in the entrance hall and told herself to go upstairs. She told herself clearly and specifically. She didn't go upstairs. She stood in the quiet entrance hall at 10 past midnight, and she heard, through the not quite closed study door, the Dowager's voice, low and strained and entirely unlike its usual controlled precision. "You have to know, Edmund. Someone has to tell you. I have been sitting with this for weeks and I cannot. She is a good woman. She is a genuinely good woman, and I have not been kind to her, and I am ashamed of that, but Edmund," a pause. Cecilia's hand went still at her side. "She is dying." The entrance hall was very quiet. "The doctor told me weeks ago. She has been ill for 2 years. She is dying, Edmund, and she hasn't told you, and everyone in that room tonight knew except you, and I cannot watch you walk into this without silence." Then Edmund's voice, very quiet, very even. "I know, Mother," a longer silence. Cecilia stood in the entrance hall and stopped breathing. "I know," Edmund said again. "I've known for some time." Cecilia went upstairs. She went upstairs and she closed her door and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark in her too old green dress, and she sat there for a very long time without moving. He knew. He had known. He had knelt on the library floor and asked her to marry him, and he had known. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, against the ache that lived there permanently now, and looked at the dark window and tried to understand what to do with that. She couldn't. She went to Miriam's door and knocked once. Miriam opened it immediately. She hadn't been asleep either, clearly, and looked at Cecilia's face and said nothing. She simply stepped back and let her in. Cecilia sat in the chair by Miriam's fire and said, "He knew." Miriam was very still. "He knew before he asked me." Cecilia's voice was even, precise, the voice she used for things she was managing. "He knew the whole time, A pause. "Cease, I heard the dowager tell him tonight." And he said she stopped. "He said I know. I've known for some time." The fire crackled. "I don't know what to do with that," Cecilia said. "I had a plan. I had a plan and it made sense, and it was manageable, and now I don't." She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that." Miriam sat down across from her and looked at her with clear, steady eyes. "I think," she said carefully, "that tomorrow morning you need to talk to him." Cecilia looked at the fire. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do." She came down at 7. She had not slept. She had sat in Miriam's chair until the fire burned to ash, then gone to her own room and watched the dark garden become a gray garden, become a pale, frost-sharp November morning, and she had thought about what she was going to say. She had prepared 3 versions. The first was dignified and measured and explained everything in the correct order, and ended with a clear and reasonable proposal for how they might proceed. The engagement dissolved quietly. No scandal, no damage to either party. The whole thing managed with the competence she had been applying to difficult situations her entire life. The second was shorter and less dignified, and involved considerably less management. The third she discarded entirely because it started with "I'm sorry," and she had decided, somewhere around 4 in the morning, that she was done apologizing for being ill. She had not chosen it. She had not arranged it for anyone's inconvenience. She was done apologizing for it. She put on her plainest dress, gray wool, no ornamentation, the dress she wore when she wanted no part of her appearance to be doing any work, and went downstairs. Edmund was already in the breakfast room. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, not drinking it, looking out at the frost-white garden with the expression of a man who had also not slept, and was also not going to mention it. He turned when she came in, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the breakfast table with its careful arrangement of silver and china, and things neither of them were going to eat. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly. "I'd rather stand." A pause. "All right." She stood at her end of the table. He stood at his. The morning light came in flat and pale between them. She had her 3 versions ready. She said none of them. What she said was, "Were you ever going to tell me that you knew?" Edmund set his coffee cup down on the windowsill with the careful placement of a man buying himself 1 second. "Yes," he said. When you told me." He held her gaze. "I was waiting for you to tell me." The breakfast room was very quiet. "That could have been never," Cecilia said. "I know, I had a plan," she said. "I was going to." She stopped. She looked at the table. She looked back at him. "I was going to manage it. I was going to be a good wife for whatever time there was, and then I was going to go." Quietly, without making it, she stopped again. "I was going to make sure it wasn't too terrible for you." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said again. His voice was very even. "I understood that from the beginning. And you asked me anyway." "Yes. Why?" The word came out simpler than she intended, stripped of all the versions she'd prepared, just the bare and genuine question underneath all of them. "Why would you do that? Why would you ask someone to marry you knowing?" She stopped. "Knowing what you knew." Edmund moved away from the window. He came around the table, not quickly, not with any dramatic purposefulness, just steadily, the way he did everything, and stopped in front of her. Close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face, the careful control of it, and underneath the control, something that was not controlled at all. "Because you deserve to be chosen," he said. "Not managed. Not handled. Not quietly taken care of from a distance." His voice was low and entirely direct. "You have been taking care of yourself, and everyone around you since before your father was in the ground. You have been small and quiet and undemanding. I imagine you've been told that's a virtue. I imagine you've believed it." He paused. "I wanted you to be chosen. Plainly. On purpose." With complete information, Cecilia looked at him. "You say that," she said carefully. "But you didn't have complete information. You knew I was ill. You didn't know, you don't know what that means. What it looks like. What you would be agreeing to." "No," Edmund said. "I don't know exactly. I know what the letter said. I know what Hargrove told my mother." A pause. "I know what I saw at the ball last night." The silence. Cecilia felt the blood in her glove, the white glove she had already rolled and placed at the very bottom of her traveling trunk this morning, the first thing she'd done at dawn. She held his gaze. "I'm not frightened of it," Edmund said quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to protect me from it." He paused. "I am, however, very angry that you were carrying it alone." Something shifted in Cecilia's chest. "You have no right to be angry," she said. Reflexively, the way you said something you'd been saying internally for a long time. "I know," he said. "I'm angry anyway." She looked at him, this impossible, angular, thoroughly inconvenient man, and felt the first version and the second version, and the discarded third version all dissolve quietly, leaving nothing behind except the plain and terrible truth of the moment. "I didn't want you to stay out of pity," she said. Quietly. "That was the whole of it. I didn't want to be the thing you endured out of kindness." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Is that what you think this is?" he said. "I didn't know what it was. I still don't entirely, then let me be clear." He said it without heat, without any performance of feeling, just the direct, declarative plainness that was, she had learned, the most authentic register he had. "I am not a man who does things out of obligation. I did not return from the war and run a 20,000-acre estate and manage 200 tenants and sit through 40 years of my mother's winter balls out of pity, Miss Vane." A pause. "I asked you because I wanted to. I knew the full extent of what I was asking, and I wanted to. That is the only explanation I have, and I'm aware it may not be a satisfying one." The morning light lay across the floor between them. Cecilia looked at him for a long time. "It's a satisfying one," she said finally. Very quietly. Edmund exhaled one breath, controlled, and something in his shoulders changed. They stood in the breakfast room in the early morning quiet, not touching, not moving, and the space between them felt different than it had 60 seconds ago. Smaller. Not closed, not yet, but different. "There's something else," Edmund said. She waited. He went back to the window. He picked up the coffee cup, set it down again. He turned to face her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something, and is now deciding whether the rehearsed version is the honest one. "I wrote to a physician in Zurich," he said. 8 weeks ago." Cecilia went still. "His name is Dr. Albrecht. There is work being done. Treatments. Not cures, I want to be precise. I will not tell you it's a cure because I don't know that and I won't lie to you." He held her gaze. "But there are cases. There are documented cases of stabilization. Of people who were where you are and who have more time than they were told." The room was very quiet. "You wrote to him," Cecilia said. 8 weeks ago, yes, before you asked me." A pause. "Yes, you were already," she stopped. "Before I said yes. Before I said anything. You were already, yes." His voice was steady. "I want to be precise about what it means and what it doesn't. It is not a certainty. It is not even a probability I can give you a number for. It is a possibility that did not exist before, and I wanted you to have access to it. He paused. I should have told you sooner. I was waiting until I had a reply, and then I was waiting until you had said yes, and then I was another pause. I was waiting for the right moment, and I recognize now that I was also afraid you would refuse it. Refuse what? Refuse to try. He looked at her directly. Because it would give you hope. And I think you have been very careful about hope. Cecilia said nothing. She stood in the plain gray dress in the pale morning light and thought about hope, about the specific discipline of not having it, which she had practiced for 2 years until it had become a kind of peace, a flat and manageable terrain that asked nothing of her. She thought about what it would mean to pick it up again, what it would cost if she picked it up and it broke. I need to sit down, she said. Edmund pulled a chair from the table immediately, not making anything of it, not hovering, and she sat, and he sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. What does the physician say? She asked finally. Edmund reached into his coat and produced a letter, folded, well-handled, read many times. He placed it on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't touch it yet. He says he cannot promise years, Edmund said quietly. But he says, his exact words, that he no longer promises only months. There is a course of treatment. It requires travel to begin with. It requires commitment and discomfort and a great deal of uncertainty. He paused. He also says that the earlier the intervention, the greater the likelihood of meaningful extension. Extension. Such a careful word for such an enormous thing. Cecilia looked at the letter on the table between them. She thought about Pip and the roses and the 41 books. She thought about the goodbye she had already said to all of them. She thought about the moment in the entrance hall last night, when she had drawn breath and started to say it, and how close she had come, and how it had felt not like relief exactly, but like the first movement toward it. She picked up the letter. She read it slowly, carefully to the end. Edmund waited. He did not watch her read. He looked out the window at the frost-sharp garden with the steady patience of a man who had made his case and was prepared to live with whatever came next. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at her hands, the thin fingers, the faint shadows, and sat with it. Why? She said again. Not the same question as before. A different one, smaller and more specific. Why would you do all of this for someone you had met for 10 days? Edmund turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment, with that expression, the one she had finally named last night in the entrance hall when everything had rearranged itself. Because 10 days was enough to know, he said simply. It has always been enough for me. I knew in the library on the first evening. I knew when you said thank you and meant something else entirely. I knew when you played Schubert in an empty room, a pause. I knew when you turned down a Duke without blinking, which I suspect no one has done in the last decade. Despite everything, despite the letter on the table, and the tiredness in both their faces, and the weight of the last 12 hours, Cecilia felt something happen at the corner of her mouth. 11 days, she said. Edmund looked at her. It was 11 days, she said. Not 10, a pause. 11 days, he agreed. And the thing that happened at the corner of his mouth was the closest she had ever seen him come to a smile. 11 days was more than sufficient. They sat in the breakfast room until the coffee was cold, and the frost had melted off the garden, and the morning had fully committed to itself. They talked, really talked, without management, without the careful performance of fine, for the first time. Cecilia told him about the first winter she had known. The specific morning. The specific cold. The the particular quality of the silence in her father's house after the doctor left, and she sat alone at the kitchen table and understood what the rest of her life was going to look like. Edmund listened without interrupting, without the expressions people made when they were absorbing difficult information and wanting you to know they were absorbing it. He simply listened, the way he did everything with his whole and undivided attention. Then he told her about the peninsula. Not the parts she had read about in letters and newspapers, the victories, the campaigns, the clean narrative of military history. The other parts, the parts that had given him the careful way he moved, and the old injury in his leg, and the inability to sleep past 5 in the morning. Cecilia listened without interrupting. When he finished, they sat for a moment in the plain and simple companionship of two people who have told each other true things and found the other still present. "I have a condition," Cecilia said. Edmund waited. "If I agree to see this physician," she stopped. "If I agree to try, I need you to understand something." She looked at him directly. "I will not spend whatever time I have. Whether it is the time I expected or more than that, I will not spend it being ill in front of you. I will not be managed or watched or handled." A pause. "I have been somebody's responsibility my entire life. I don't want to be yours." Edmund held her gaze. "I don't want a responsibility," he said. "I want a wife." He paused. "There is a difference. I know the difference. Then you know that what I'm asking for is equal ground." He said it simply. "You tell me when it's bad. I tell you when it's bad. Nobody manages anyone." A pause. "That's the only arrangement I'm interested in." Cecilia looked at him. "You understand I'm not accustomed to that," she said. "I know." A pause. "Neither am I. We can be poor at it together." She looked at the letter on the table, at the cold coffee, at Edmund's face in the pale morning light, tired and direct and entirely, inconveniently genuine. She thought about the plan she had built so carefully in the dark of 4 in the morning. The manageable plan. The quiet, self-sufficient, dignified plan that asked nothing of anyone and left everyone intact. She thought about what it would mean to put it down. "All right," she said. Edmund was very still. "I'll see the physician," she said. "I'm not promising anything beyond that. I'm not promising to be hopeful or optimistic or any of the other things people expect from someone in my position." She paused. "But I'll see him." Edmund nodded once. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he wasn't going to perform. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." Silence. Then Cecilia said, "You kept a sprig from the book." Edmund blinked. The non sequitur had landed exactly as she intended. "I saw it," she said. "Under the paperweight in your study. The same one as the book you left outside my door." A pause. "I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to identify it." A silence. "Hawthorne," Edmund said. "It means hope." He paused. "I'm aware that's sentimental. It is sentimental. Yes, I didn't know you were sentimental." "I'm not," he said. "Generally." Cecilia looked at him for a moment. 11 days, she said again quietly. 11 days, he confirmed. Outside, the frost-white garden had turned gold in the morning sun, bare branches casting long shadows across the cold ground, and somewhere in it a bird was singing with the cheerful disregard of something that simply did not know it was November. The journey to Zurich took 11 days. Cecilia counted them, not anxiously, not with the particular dread of someone measuring out what remained, but with the attentiveness she had developed over 2 years of understanding that days were not guaranteed and therefore worth the noticing. The Channel crossing, gray and cold and indifferent to the fact that it was making her ill. The long flat stretches of northern France, bare-fielded and frost-silvered, passing outside the carriage window like pages turning. The slow climb into Switzerland, the air-changing quality as the altitude climbed, becoming something cleaner and more demanding, as if it expected more of the lungs it entered. Edmund sat across from her in the carriage and read, mostly. Or held a book open and looked out the window. She had learned to tell the difference. Miriam had come as far as Dover, and then gone home to her husband and her baby, with the expression of someone leaving a person at a dock and needing very badly to believe the ship was sound. She had held Cecilia's hands at the carriage door and said nothing for a long moment, which was, for Miriam, the most serious form of communication available, and then said, "Write to me. Every week." "I mean it, every week," Cecilia had confirmed. And Cecilia, Miriam had glanced briefly at Edmund, standing a few feet away with the studied distance of a man giving space where space was needed. Let him help. Actually let him. Not the version of letting him where you accept help and then immediately work out how to need less of it. Cecilia had opened her mouth. "I know your faces," Miriam said. "All of them." That was the one that means you're about to say of course, and means something more complicated. Cecilia had closed her mouth. She thought about that in the carriage, watching Edmund not read his book. She thought about it in the particular way of someone who has been given accurate information they are not yet certain how to use. Dr. Heinrich Albrecht was 60 years old, Swiss-German and possessed of the kind of quietness that is not the absence of something but the presence of a great deal of it, settled and still. His clinic occupied the upper floor of a stone building on a street that smelled of pine and cold water, and his consulting room had 2 large windows that looked out at the mountains, which Cecilia found either encouraging or ironic depending on the hour. He examined her for a very long time. He asked questions she had not been asked before, specific, unhurried, following each answer to its logical next question, the way a person follows a path, not because they know where it leads, but because the path is there, and the path is the point. Edmund waited outside. She had asked him to. He had said of course without hesitation, which meant he had known she was going to ask. When Dr. Albrecht had finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental kindness of a man who spent his professional life at the intersection of hope and accuracy. "You have been ill for 2 years," he said. "Yes, and for 2 years you have been," he paused, choosing. "Economical. With your energy. With your expectations. Yes, that has kept you here," he said simply. "The carefulness has kept you here. I want you to understand that first, before anything else. The choices you made in ignorance were not wrong. You are here in part because of them." Cecilia sat with that for a moment. Nobody had told her that before. "The question now," Albrecht continued, "is whether here can become somewhere further." He placed both hands flat on the desk. "I will not give you numbers. I have learned not to give people numbers. They carry them poorly. They become the number instead of themselves." A pause. "What I will tell you is that there is a course of treatment. It is long. It is not comfortable. It will require you to remain in Zurich for a minimum of 3 months, and after that to continue with significant care for longer." He looked at her steadily. "It may not work. I will not pretend otherwise. There are cases in which it has not worked. There are also cases," he paused, "cases in which people are still here, 5 years later. 6. Living carefully but living." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the mountains were entirely indifferent, which she found surprisingly comforting. "What does the treatment involve?" she asked. He told her. She listened to all of it, the detail, the difficulty, the specific discomforts, the things that would be required of her body and her patience and her willingness to exist in uncertainty for an extended and unspecified period. She listened without flinching, not because she wasn't frightened, but because she had made a decision, somewhere in the Swiss foothills, that she was going to hear the true version of things from now on. No management. No edited summaries delivered at a careful distance. When he finished, she said, she paused. The word was still new in her mouth, still finding its shape. My husband is outside. I'd like him to hear this as well. Albrecht nodded. Of course. Edmund came in and sat beside her and listened to everything. He listened the way he always listened, with complete attention, without performance, without the particular restless discomfort that people displayed when they were hearing something they didn't want to hear and wanting you to know it was difficult for them. He asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one the question Cecilia would have asked next if she hadn't already been thinking about the one after. When Albrecht finished, Edmund looked at Cecilia. She looked at him. I want to try, she said. I've decided. Edmund nodded once. Then he turned to Albrecht and said, what does she need? Specifically, all of it, lodging, diet, restrictions on activity, what I should watch for, what constitutes an emergency and what doesn't, and what you need from me to make this as likely to work as it can possibly be. Albrecht looked at him for a moment. Then he said, with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, you had better take notes. Edmund produced from his coat pocket a small leather notebook and a pencil. Cecilia looked at the notebook. You brought a notebook, she said. I told you. I prepare for contingencies. You brought it to a medical consultation in Switzerland. I bring it everywhere. He glanced at her briefly. Is that alarming? She looked at him. This man with his notebook and his pencil and his 3 precise questions and his hawthorn sprig under a paperweight, and felt something that was not quite laughing and not quite crying but lived in the warm territory between them. No, she said. It isn't alarming at all. They took rooms at a house on a quiet street 10 minutes from the clinic. A tall, narrow building with wooden shutters, and a landlady named Frau Hofer who had apparently hosted Albrecht's patients before and treated the whole arrangement with brisk, unsentimental efficiency that Cecilia found enormously restful. The rooms were plain and warm and smelled of wood and good bread. There were 2 windows in the sitting room that looked out at a street where the snow, when it came, would be deep and clean, and nothing like the gray London version she was accustomed to. The first week of treatment was difficult in the way that Albrecht had said it would be difficult, specifically, honestly, without embellishment. Cecilia was tired in a new way, more purposeful somehow, as if her body was spending energy on something instead of simply losing it. She slept in the afternoons. She ate the things Frau Hofer produced with implacable regularity at the correct hours. She walked for exactly the distances Albrecht had specified, no more, on streets that were cold and clean and quiet. Edmund walked with her. Every day the same streets, the same pace, slow enough to be useful, steady enough to feel like something. He didn't talk when she didn't want to talk. He talked when she did. He learned without being told the difference. She told him things on those walks. Small things at first, memories, observations, the particular texture of a day from her childhood, the name of the village lending library where she had left her books. Then larger things, the things she had carried alone, the long specific weight of the last 2 years. He received them all the same way, present, still, adding them to whatever he was building of her in his mind without making her feel examined. He told her things too. More than she expected. More, she suspected, than he had told most people. The specific parts of the war that lived in the body rather than the memory, in the left leg, in the early mornings, in the particular quality of silence that still sometimes felt dangerous. The years after, managing the estate alone, the specific loneliness of a house that sighs with no one in it who knew you. I was beginning to think, he said one afternoon on the cold street near the river, that I had simply become someone who didn't require it. Company. Knowing and being known, he paused. I had made my peace with it, and now, Cecilia asked. He looked at her, sideways, in the manner he had when he was being precise. Now I think I was wrong, he said simply. The second month was harder. The treatment's middle passage was, Albrecht had warned her, the most demanding, the point at which the body had absorbed the initial effort and had not yet begun to show anything in return. It was, he said, the part where people gave up. Not dramatically, not in a single decisive moment of refusal, but slowly by increments, by the accumulating weight of discomfort and uncertainty. And the seductive logic of it isn't working. Nothing is changing. Why continue? Cecilia understood that logic intimately. She had been using it in the other direction for 2 years. There was a morning in the 6th week when she woke before dawn with her chest seized tight and her breath shallow, and the familiar cold certainty. The one she had lived with so long it had become almost companionable, that this was it. That the treatment had been a gesture, a comfort, a thing people did because the alternative to doing something was unbearable, and that the something had simply not been enough. She lay in the dark and was afraid. Really afraid, not the managed, handled, kept at a distance version. The real version, the one she had been too careful and too competent to let herself feel for 2 years. She was afraid and she was alone, and the dark was very dark. Then she heard a sound in the sitting room. Movement, careful, deliberate, the sound of someone trying not to wake her. The glow of a candle under the door. She got up. Edmund was in the sitting room in his shirt sleeves, building up the fire with the focused attention of a man performing a task he has assigned himself. He turned when she appeared in the doorway, and he looked at her face, just looked, 1 second, and he didn't say you should be sleeping or go back to bed or any of the reasonable things. He said, come sit down. She came and sat down. He sat beside her, not touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they looked at the fire he had built until it had caught and was steady and orange and real. I'm frightened, she said. The first time she had said it. To anyone. I know, he said. I don't want to die, I know, I've been, she stopped. I've been so careful about not wanting things. I've been so careful about not wanting more than I was likely to get. And I don't, she stopped again. I don't want to stop now. I want more. I want the ordinary things. I want years of ordinary things, and I'm so frightened that I've only just worked that out and it's too late. Edmund turned then, fully turned, which he didn't always do, and looked at her directly. It is not too late, he said. I will not tell you I know that with certainty, because you asked me not to lie to you, and I won't. But it is not too late, and Albrecht said the 6th week would be the worst, and tomorrow is the 7th week, and you are going to eat the breakfast Frau Hofer brings and walk the street by the river and come back and sit with the fire, and we are going to do this 1 day at a time for as long as it takes. She looked at him. 1 day at a time, she said. That's all it is, he said. That's the only size it needs to be. She looked at the fire. After a while she said, you should sleep. I'm not tired, he said. She looked at him. You have a not tired face, he said before she could speak. I don't, she looked at him for a moment. No, she agreed. You don't. They sat by the fire until the candle burned down and the room was lit only by the steady orange glow, and neither of them spoke very much, and it was enough. The morning of the 10th week, Albrecht examined her for a long time and then sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Cecilia sat across from him and waited with the stillness she had learned. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her with those direct, unsentimental eyes. "The progression has stopped," he said. 3 words. 4 syllables. Cecilia sat with them. "The progression has stopped." "Stopped," she said. "Stopped," he paused. "Not reversed, I want to be precise. The damage that exists. But the advancement," he placed both hands flat on the desk. "I have not seen this before in a case of your duration. I want you to understand both things. I have not seen it, which means I cannot tell you what comes next with any certainty." A pause. "What I can tell you is that you are not where you were. You are somewhere else. Somewhere I did not expect you to reach." Cecilia looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the morning 2 years ago in her father's cold kitchen, when she had understood what the rest of her life was going to look like. She thought about the 41 books. She thought about the roses. "What do I do now?" she asked. "You continue," Albrecht said simply. "Carefully. With attention. You continue, and you come back to me in 3 months, and you continue after that." He paused. "You live carefully, Your Grace. You live carefully, and you see what carefully gives you." Cecilia stood. She shook his hand. She walked out of the consulting room with the steadiness she had maintained for 2 years through everything, and she went through the door to the waiting room where Edmund was on his feet the moment he heard her step, his face arranged in the careful neutral of a man who has been sitting with hope for 10 weeks and is now 1 second from knowing whether it was worth it. She looked at him. She thought about what to say. She had no prepared version. For once, she had nothing prepared at all. "It stopped," she said. "The progression stopped." Edmund stood very still. "Edmund," her voice was steady. "It stopped." He crossed the room in 3 steps, and his arms came around her carefully, with the particular care of someone holding something that has been fragile and may, or may not, be becoming less so, and she stood in the waiting room of Albrecht's clinic with her forehead against his shoulder and her hands flat against his coat and thought, "This is what I almost didn't let myself have. This exact thing. This is what I was going to manage away." She held on. He held on back. Outside the tall window, the mountain stood in the winter light, enormous and indifferent and magnificent, and the cold, clean air pressed against the glass, and somewhere in the city a bell was ringing the hour, and it was enough. It was more than enough. They were married in the small chapel on the estate 6 weeks after they returned to England. February early, the ground still hard with frost. Cecilia wore pale blue, not white. Edmund had asked once carefully whether she wanted white, and she had said, "White is for beginnings." "I've already begun." He had not asked again. There were 12 people present. Miriam stood beside Cecilia and cried with the uninhibited completeness of someone who had been holding it in for months and had decided that today was the correct day to stop. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew in her best black dress. She always wore black, on principle, and held herself very straight throughout the ceremony. When it was over, when the small party had moved to the house, and the toasts had been made and the fire built high in the drawing room, the Dowager appeared at Cecilia's side. She said nothing for a moment. Then she took Cecilia's hand briefly, firmly, without preamble, and held it for exactly 3 seconds. She released it. She walked away. Cecilia looked at Miriam. Miriam's eyebrow did something. "Don't," Cecilia said. "I didn't say a word," said Miriam. "The roses came back in April." Cecilia had not expected them to. She had planted them in the autumn, 12 bare root stems in the south-facing bed along the kitchen garden wall, the same variety she had kept alive with stubbornness and cold hands in her father's neglected garden. And she had planted them with the careful, present-tense hope she had been practicing for 2 years now. Not the old hope, the kind you hold at arm's length to protect yourself from it. The new kind. The kind that says, I am putting this in the ground because I intend to be here when it comes up. She had told Edmund about the roses when they planted them. About the original ones, the ones she had already said goodbye to. He had listened the way he always listened, and then he had taken off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and helped her dig for the rest of the afternoon without being asked. She thought about that now, sitting in the garden in the pale April sun with Pip asleep across her feet, watching the first red edges push through the green. The garden at Ralston was not a formal garden. It had been once. There were traces of it still, the ghost of symmetry in the older beds, the architectural remnants of something that had once been arranged and controlled and admired from a distance. But somewhere in the last 20 years it had been allowed to become itself, to sprawl and reconsider its original intentions, and what had resulted was the kind of garden that looked accidental and was not. Cecilia had added to it gradually, carefully, with the attentiveness of someone who understood that a garden was a long conversation rather than a finished statement. New beds along the south wall. A cutting garden, practical and slightly wild. An herb border outside the kitchen door that misses. Aldridge, the housekeeper, used with the quiet approval of a woman who had been asking for exactly that for 15 years. It was hers. Quietly, entirely hers, in the way that things become yours when you have tended them through a winter and watched them come back. Pip shifted on her feet and wheezed. He was older now, considerably older, moving with the philosophical slowness of an animal that has accepted time's terms and found them reasonable. He still appeared at her feet every morning with the punctual devotion of someone honoring a long-standing appointment. He still placed his chin on her knee and looked at her with that particular understanding. She reached down and scratched behind his ear. "Good morning," she told him. He closed his eyes. The letter from Miriam had arrived that morning, and Cecilia had brought it out to the garden to read properly, which was where she read letters she expected to enjoy. Miriam wrote as she spoke, at length, with feeling, with the structural confidence of someone who trusts that you will follow them wherever they go. The baby has become a person, Cease, a whole actual opinionated person. She told Edmund last Tuesday that his cravat was the wrong color, and he agreed with her completely, which tells you everything about both of them. We are coming in June, all 4 of us, and I refuse to hear anything about it being an inconvenience because it isn't, and even if it were I would still come. Henry sends his regards. The baby sends nothing because she is 2.5 and regards are not yet her currency, but I am confident she will develop some. I think about that week you came to Ashford Park sometimes. The autumn one before everything. I think about how you looked when you arrived. I knew something was wrong. I always knew, but I didn't know the shape of it yet. You were so careful, Cease. You were so determined to take up as little space as possible. I hope you are taking up space now. Enormous amounts of it. I hope you are filling every room you enter. Write back immediately. I mean it. Cecilia folded the letter and held it in her lap and smiled at the garden. She was, she thought, taking up space. It was still, sometimes, an effort. The old habits of smallness died slowly, and there were days when she caught herself making herself quieter than she needed to be, waiting for permission she no longer needed to wait for. But she was learning. She was, it turned out, a diligent student when the subject was worth learning. She heard Edmund before she saw him, the particular sound of his step on the garden path, the slight unevenness of it that she could now identify at 50 yards, that she had learned the way you learned a piece of music you have played enough times that your hands know it without your mind being involved. He came around the corner of the wall and stopped when he saw her, the way he always stopped, not because he was surprised to find her there, but because he had a habit of stopping and looking briefly before he continued. She had asked him about it once in Zurich, on one of the river walks. "Why do you always stop?" she had said. He had thought about it, the way he always thought before he answered. "I suppose," he had said finally, "I like to make sure you're still there." She had understood that completely. He came and sat beside her on the bench, the stone bench along the south wall, warm with the morning sun, wide enough for two people to sit with comfortable proximity. He had a book he wasn't going to read, and a cup of coffee that was already going cold. He sat with the settled permanence of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Pip opened one eye, assessed him, and closed it again. They sat in the April garden and said nothing for a while, which was one of their best things, the particular quality of silence between people who have nothing to prove to each other, who have already said the difficult things and the true things, and can now simply exist in the same space without requiring it to mean anything additional. The roses nodded in the faint breeze. Somewhere across the kitchen garden, a wren was conducting an argument with something, small and fierce, and entirely convinced of its own position. Edmund turned a page of his unread book. "Miriam's coming in June," Cecilia said. "I know. She wrote to me as well." Cecilia looked at him. "What did she say?" "She said she was bringing all four of them, and if I attempted to suggest it was inconvenient, she would make it considerably more inconvenient out of principle." A pause. "She also said the baby told her my study needed more flowers. She's right. She is 2.5. She is clearly perceptive." Edmund looked at her sidelong with the expression that had once been the closest thing he had to a smile, and was now, after 2 years of practice, an actual smile, still not large, still not frequent, but real in the way that only things you have earned feel real. "I'll put flowers in the study," he said. "I'll pick them," Cecilia said. "From the cutting garden. Next month when the ranunculus come up. When do ranunculus come up? May. If the frost stays off, and will it?" Cecilia looked at the garden, at the bare beds and the early roses, and the wren still engaged in its furious private dispute, and thought about the question. A year ago she would have answered it carefully, with the automatic qualification of someone who had learned not to make plans too far ahead. She had been so practiced at it, so fluent in the language of maybe and we'll see, and if things go well. She was still careful. She would always be careful. Albrecht had been clear about that, and she had made her peace with it. Careful was not the same as small. Careful was not the same as afraid. "Yes," she said simply. "The frost will stay off." Edmund looked at her. She looked back at him. It was the kind of look that contained, in its 3 seconds, the library at Ashford Park and the rain in the East Garden, and the entrance hall at midnight, and the carriage through France and Albrecht's mountains, and the fire in the Zurich sitting room at 4 in the morning, and the small cold chapel in February, and every ordinary day between then and this April bench, all of it present and held and real. Then Pip woke up and stood and shook himself and wandered away across the garden with the determined purpose of an animal who has just remembered an appointment. And the moment passed into the morning the way moments do, completely, without loss. Edmund opened his book. Cecilia lifted her face to the sun. She had said goodbye to her garden once. She never did it again.